On important front lines such as Zaporizhia Melitopol, Tokmak, Kherson Berdyansk, and, of course, Crimea, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is still going strong. The tremendous progress made by the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia Oblast in recent days in particular has had an impact on the situation in the Crimea, which is one of the most significant battlegrounds of this conflict. The liberation of Crimea from Russian control is the primary objective of the Ukrainian forces, and they intend to do it by winning victory on the southern front lines. As a consequence of this, the Ukrainian forces are currently carrying out their offensive operations in and around Zaporizhia without pausing for any period of time. Because of the failure of the Kakhovka Dam, the trenches that the Russian troops had dug in Kherson have been flooded. As a result, there is no longer any risk that the Ukrainians will come under attack from the Russians in this part of the territory. As a result, the Ukrainian military is putting in significant effort these days to neutralize the Kerch Bridge, which is one of the most vital sites connecting Crimea and Russia, and to construct an offensive corridor on the peninsula from land that is controlled by Ukraine. These attempts are being made not only by Ukrainian soldiers but also by Ukrainian partisan groups that back Kiev and are opposed to the regime of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. You may recall that just recently, various Ukrainian partisan groups participated in an important offensive operation. For these reasons, Ukrainian partisans blew up the railway bridge near Melitopol in the settlement of Yakimivka in the temporarily occupied part of the Zaporizhia region. This was done to create an offensive corridor between Crimea and Ukrainian territory and to cut off Russia's connection to the peninsula and the southern Ukrainian front lines. Local partisans were able to destroy a railway bridge that the invaders were using to transport weaponry out of the Crimea. As a result, Moscow is in an extremely precarious position in terms of obtaining military supplies. A plan of operation like this one put Russia in a vulnerable position on the southern front lines, and this was especially true when the unanticipated advances of Ukrainian soldiers in Zaporizhia persisted. However, the most significant operations taken by Ukrainian partisans in recent days have occurred in the previous few days. An important railway line that connects Russian troops stationed on the mainland of Ukraine to those stationed in seized Crimea has been the site of explosions, which have severely alarmed local inhabitants as well as Russian officials. According to the Russian telegraph channel Baza, an explosion took place on the railway in Crimea when a freight train was moving along the tracks. The explosion took place in close proximity to the moving train that was traveling in the corridor that connects Vladislavovka and Kirovska. The train conductor applied the brakes in a hurry. The blast wave caused glass to shatter inside the cockpit, although the conductor himself was not hurt in the incident. It was reported on Telegram Channel 112 that 2 railway employees had been injured by glass shards. However, they did not require hospitalization for their injuries. As a result of the damage sustained by the railroad rails, Sergei Aksionov, the governor of Crimea who was chosen by the Kremlin, stated that all rail movement had been halted. This spectacular act of attack on one of the most significant railways in Crimea caused serious damage to the Russian military supply lines, and the suspension of train traffic made it extremely difficult for Moscow to deliver assistance from Crimea to the southern Ukrainian front lines. As a consequence of this, the burden placed on the Ukrainian forces by the Russian troops' lack of access to military resources was significantly reduced throughout these front lines. In addition, this egregious act of violence was a significant contributing factor in the decision made by the Russian authorities in Crimea to evacuate their families and relatives. It was already common knowledge that the continuous Ukrainian attacks in Zaporizhia would, at some point in the future, have an effect on the region of Crimea. On the other hand, nobody anticipated that the Ukrainians' attacks, which targeted both Zaporizhia and Crimea, would be quite so successful in such a short amount of time. Because of this, the people living in the Crimea region, as well as the Russian authorities stationed on the peninsula, along with their families and other relatives, sped up the preparations they were making to relocate to far safer regions. The most recent explosion that occurred on the Crimean Railway was referred to as the final warning for the people who live on the peninsula. The Ukrainian government has chosen not to comment on the claims of explosions on railroad tracks on the peninsula. However, Ukrainian partisan forces that operate autonomously in the seized Crimea and other regions of southern Ukraine were quick to claim responsibility for this attack on their territory. Atesh's Telegram account, which claimed responsibility for a number of partisan activities, including the bombing of Russian military assets in Crimea and attacks against Russian-appointed administration officials, revealed the specifics of the attack that occurred on the train that was traveling between Vladislavovka and Kirovska. It was highlighted in the joint statement that was made by the attached group that the only way to achieve success is by working together as a unit. It was also one of the statistics in the proclamation that the efforts of the Ukrainian partisan movements will continue to seek collaboration while simultaneously working to destroy the pro-war Russian forces that are located on the peninsula. The joint declaration included a number of crucial pieces of information, one of which was the trifurcation of the Ukrainian partisan groupings. The Tesh, the Berdian partisans, and the Mariupol opposition were the names given to this group. There is a lack of information regarding the organization, size, and breadth of the three Ukrainian partisan groups that were listed. And the Ukrainian authorities do not disclose a significant amount of information regarding them. There is only one thing that can be said with certainty about these groups, and that is that the liberation of Ukraine is their shared objective. Despite this, allegations of partisan operations in the occupied territory of Crimea and southern Ukraine are a matter of public record. Partisans frequently use shaping movements as a military strategy, and they do so frequently before more conventional operations by regular Ukrainian military troops. This is because shaping movements are extremely effective at disrupting supply lines. We were witnesses to the tremendous acts of partisan organizations, in particular before the offensive operations of the Ukrainian army on the front lines of Crimea and southern Ukraine. These actions frequently involve verified bombings, arson assaults, and acts of sabotage directed against energy pipelines, refineries, storage facilities, rail lines, and transit hubs on these front lines, specifically in regions covering Crimea and southern Ukraine. In addition, partisan groups take action against the concentration of Russian forces on the same fronts in barracks, sites of military-industrial complexes, and ammunition depots. These operations are carried out by partisan groups. The intelligence sector is where the majority of the other activities of Ukrainian partisan parties that are molding the country are developing. You are aware that Ukrainian forces have successfully carried out long-range strikes using airborne weapons on both the Crimean and southern front lines. These strikes included the use of UK Storm Shadow missiles as well as additional missiles supplied by allies. There is a good chance that Ukrainian partisans were the ones who initially supplied the target identification data for these missile strikes. Partisan organizations, in other words, not only carry out their activities in operational zones, but they also give vital intelligence data to the Ukrainian army. Expelling those who had taken part in Russian administrations within seized Ukrainian territory was another significant aspect of partisan activity that played a significant role. Since the beginning of the large-scale invasion, it is common knowledge that over 80 Russian officials perceived to be collaborators have been eliminated from their positions or injured by partisan forces by the use of car bombs, small arms fire, or other methods with other types of homemade explosive devices. In addition, guerrilla fighters in occupied territory participated in psychological operations, such as the dissemination of information and the conduct of digital campaigning. Graffiti and other operations of a similar nature, as well as intelligence gathering and transmission to Ukrainian authorities. For instance, as Ukrainian forces push to liberate Kherson, resistance fighters have been conducting frontal strikes and providing regular troops with surveillance. Partisans from Ukraine have only lately published photographs on their Telegram channel depicting a group of Russian soldiers with the caption, "We are watching you." Partisan organizations also courageously hung banners on key front lines, such as Kherson Melitopol and Berdyansk, with the message, "If HIMARS can't reach you, a partisan will." The Russians did not take into account the circumstances that were present. While it is true that partisans do not typically win battles, they do have the ability to cause harm to the logistics and infrastructure behind the lines. These are two elements that are essential to the process of winning a war. Because of this, the government of Ukraine has publicly supported partisan actions, not only by supplying them with weaponry but also by providing them with online resources like Telegram channels and websites that encourage and train them. The National Center for the Resistance of Ukraine has issued a number of instructions that detail how to use drones, how to seize Russian tanks, and how to make improvised weapons like Molotov cocktails, among other topics. In addition, the Special Operations Forces of Ukraine have been delegated a number of authorities and responsibilities by the National Resistance Center. These included important operations such as training, organizing, and scaling movements against the occupation of Ukraine. Other actions included teaching peaceful resistance, supporting partisans, obtaining information on Russian forces, and establishing underground communications. One of the responsibilities and powers that were delegated was the obligation to keep the Ukrainian people informed about what was happening in the land that was being temporarily occupied. In a word, this is the method that the Ukrainians use to plant the seeds of re-emancipation all throughout the seized regions, including the Crimean Peninsula, the southern front lines of Ukraine, and everywhere else. And the resistance is still going strong over the entirety of Ukraine, picking up right where it left off. During the time when the Ukrainian counteroffensive was being carried out, a number of pieces of Ukrainian equipment were destroyed or stolen by the occupying forces. Following that, Ukraine established a few strategic approaches and focused its attention on the conquered territory. He was successful in driving out the Russian troops that had been temporarily occupying the lands, and he regained control of the territories. Even though the counteroffensive has only been underway for a week, the Ukraine has already taken control of or is very close to taking control of several of the territories that were temporarily controlled. Today, high-powered rockets from Mars carried out a sustained assault on Russian strongholds. A video that has been circulated seems to show high-powered Mars rockets from Ukraine taking out a Russian Grad multiple-launch rocket system. After the prisoner swap that took place the day before, Ukrainian President Zelensky stated that they would free all Ukrainian soldiers being held captive by the Russians and that we would not hand over anything from Ukraine to the Russians. He was speaking in the direction of Zaporizhia. The people of Russia are expressing their dissatisfaction with the existing state of affairs, as well as with Putin's geopolitical decisions and the invasion that he has led against Ukraine. When asked in an interview whether there is anything in Russia about which they may be proud, Russians are unable to provide an answer. Store supreme. And there, before me, is the reason why they chose the toughest option. Protests calling for an end to the war are being organized by the populace. They want Putin to stop the war agenda he is currently carrying out and return home. An ambassador from the United Kingdom, speaking to a TV channel, forecasted that the Ukrainian military would launch a significant operation in Donbass within the next few days. What exactly is going on in Ukraine right now? What's going on? The counteroffensive has now started. Indeed, it has been. But, I encourage caution in believing that we are simply going to surge in, that the Ukrainians are just going to surge in, and then the Russians would be dispersed, and it would all be done very, very quickly. I mean, that's just not going to happen. Over a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers, we can observe a significant amount of shaping and probing operations taking place. Frontline, they are attempting to demoralize the forces, put them to the test, and identify where the genuine weaknesses are. You actually have the primary capability of the Ukrainian military still in reserve, if you will, and it is prepared for that one specific assault. The Russians have no idea where it is going to be, but the Wagner Group and the Russian soldiers themselves are currently engaged in a chaotic struggle for control of the area. That they are not in a favorable position, which they are, is demonstrated by the explosion that occurred at the Kakhovka Dam, regardless of whether it was done intentionally or by mistake. Putin didn't even have faith that they would be able to keep that down, which was extremely important since it was a bridge across the Dnipro to the other side. As a matter of fact, it will inflict a greater amount of harm on the Russian armed forces and the Crimean Peninsula than it will on the Ukrainians. In light of this, we should brace ourselves for a massive assault in some sectors of the Donbass within the next several days. According to the head of the military committee in the United Kingdom Parliament, Ukraine is planning to begin a significant offensive against Russian soldiers in the eastern Donbass region within the next several days. The Ukraine maintains control over the districts, from where it will launch a counterattack using unmanned aerial vehicles. At the same time, it searches the temporarily controlled areas for defensive armaments and anti-aircraft guns, and then eliminates each one individually. The mobile electronic warfare system used by the Russian military is currently being eliminated. Artillery fire, according to what can be seen in the video, was responsible for the destruction of the electronic warfare vehicle. Yeah, sure. We fill you in on every aspect of what she's shared with you so that you are aware. Proceed there then. Mr. Agentsu Hundrinsk August Gura Pisko, Neros, and Gashania are in this now, and those individuals are not. Pia told the optician that she was treating the fact that the results are really not being set up by me on an attacker and episode. She visited the doctor more, and she was cared for by Boo. Could it be Boo? Is it a game being played by Simon irrespective of the globe, Ukraine, and others done by me, and I came here to pre-tage to see her show? This new school sheet has you in its sights. I'm sorry, but it's not quite that analytical. Not the easiest thing to do on Skype. What exactly do we need to know? We will continue to share information about this event with you and add new details as they become available. You will be able to keep up with the most recent developments. The long-awaited operation that Ukraine has been planning to recover territory that has been occupied by Russia has finally begun. The attacking forces of the Ukrainian armed forces are pushing forward toward Berdyansk at a steady pace. The Ukrainian army conducted a massive counterattack as part of their offensive operations. This was accomplished by attaining an adequate level of striking force and significantly degrading the Russian infrastructure. During the operation, Ukrainian forces are making steady headway towards the objectives they have set for themselves. They began their journey in this direction. The most recent intelligence received from the front indicates that the Ukrainian armed forces have achieved progress in the offensive operation that is being conducted in the direction of Berdyansk. In one instance, they were able to seize control of an area that was up to 3 kilometers square. Kovalev conducted an assessment of the outcomes of the counterattack operation that the Ukrainian army had undertaken. In a live broadcast from the Military Press Center of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Andrei Kovalyev, spokesman of the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, stated that in the offensive operation carried out in the Tavria and Donetsk operational regions, the troops of an offensive grouping of the Ukrainian Defense Forces advanced from 500 meters to 1 kilometer. This information was provided in the direction of Berdyansk in the Zaporizhzhia region. In the direction of Berdyansk, and we've made it to 3 square kilometers of territory. In a separate statement issued by the Ukrainian military, it was alleged that Russia had forcibly evacuated the Ukrainian people from the territory. Residents of the port city of Berdyansk in Ukraine, which Russia had occupied very immediately after the invasion the previous year, were forced to flee their homes while preparations were made for a Russian counteroffensive in Kiev and Berdyansk. A city that has a population of roughly 100,000 people is recognized for being a port and an important center for the export of many commodities, including coal, grain, sunflower, seed, oil, and iron, from Ukraine. The city of Berdyansk may be found on the coast of the Azov Sea, which eventually leads into the Black Sea. He made the announcement during the counterattack that the Ukraine was launching in the towns and villages that were located near the front in this port city. Priority was given to the evacuation of people, particularly youngsters who were accompanied by a member of their family or a friend. According to the article, individuals who were forced to flee this port city were relocated to temporary housing facilities in the Zaporizhzhia region, which is the location of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. According to earlier reports, Ukrainian forces succeeded in recapturing 7 communities from Russian forces throughout the past week. Those settlements included Lobkov, Levan, Novo, Derivka, Nest Kukny, Storozhiv, Makarivka, and Blatildante. During the time that Russia's large-scale invasion was taking place in ways that very few people had imagined, Ukraine proved itself to be an exceptional warrior. The valiant defense of Mariupol was ultimately responsible for preventing the Russian occupation forces from taking control of the entire southern region of Ukraine. In fact, Mariupol freed the entirety of the southern region of Ukraine. There would be neither Nikolaev nor Odessa at this point in time if Mariupol had not been defended and if the Russians had not been compelled to redeploy forces in order to block the counterattack that was being mounted by the Ukrainians. In a statement, the Deputy Minister of Defense for Ukraine, Alexander Pavlyuk, claimed that they would join the old group and head to Transnistria, as well as Ukraine's connection with the Black Sea would have all communication utterly severed. In addition, the group of defensive troops in the east managed to keep the enemy's potential under control by seizing all of its combat-ready units, which in turn destroyed the enemy's potential. In the past few weeks, the Ukrainian armed forces have begun to achieve significant success. Critical attacks have been carried out in the occupied parts of Ukraine as a direct result of Russia's incursions on the Crimean Peninsula, which it annexed in 2014. Such as the destruction of almost 50 Russian ammo stores and the use of artillery against Russian command forces. On the other hand, the Russians do not have sufficient manpower or resources to safeguard the frontline logistics. This demonstrates that the logistics systems have been pushed to their limits and are unstable as a result. In addition, the Russian military lacks the men, energy, and resources necessary to continue operating. To launch yet another significant offensive operation as part of the ongoing onslaught against Russia. With each new assault on strategic locations like arsenals and command headquarters, Russia was forced to move its supply points further and further back. And we can argue that the situation in Moscow has become increasingly challenging over the past few months. When the specialists consider where we are in the conflict, they are of the opinion that we will have won the battle by the end of the year. After February 24, Ukraine will be in a position to negotiate with Russia to regain control of the occupied regions of the country, including Crimea and Donbass, within the next 1 to 2 years. During the fierce struggle, something transpired that would later become more transparent in the months that would follow. It does not matter whether they are regular units, conscripts, airborne soldiers, tank crews, or mechanized infantry, the Russian army is badly governed overall. Logistics, artillery, or combat engineers and logistical support. The invading Russian forces are not very motivated, have insufficient training, and are short on supplies. They are completely unprepared and unable to perform the duties because they do not have any meals, ammunition, or fuel available to them. They were led to believe that they were fighting for their lives and the lives of their families, and they were ordered to complete the first strong resistance by highly motivated Ukrainian ground forces. The Russians' invasion was indiscriminate and poorly resourced, but the existence of their nation caused them to pay a high price for their actions. In spite of some early victories in the south and east of Ukraine, Russia's military effort was a clear failure in practically every aspect of the conflict. Not only has Ukraine been victorious in the majority of the battles it has participated in, but it is also prevailing in the wars of propaganda and morale. Because time is such a precious commodity, it has led to the emergence of military forces that are far better trained and equipped. Since then, the Ukraine has made use of the time to prepare its new brigades for the highly anticipated counterattack, which it expects will ultimately result in the war being won in its favor. In a nutshell, even Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, realized that time was no longer on his side, at least in the short term. Time passes quickly for everyone, not just the top officials in Ukraine and Russia. In spite of the fact that the occupation is entirely unjustifiable, many people in the West have reiterated the commitments of the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as NATO, the European Union, Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, and others, to help Ukraine for the longest amount of time feasible. The fact that the counteroffensive is currently being launched has boosted people's optimism. We'll be successful in protecting and regaining a sufficient amount of land to appease Putin and convince him to sit down for negotiations. On top of that, new information has surfaced indicating that Russian forces lost their lives while fleeing their minefields. As a result of continuing attacks by the Ukrainians, Russian soldiers are reportedly suffering injuries as a result of mines that they planted themselves and detonated in their own minefields. The British Ministry of Defense stated in its daily report that some Russian army units were probably withdrawing in some disorder amid growing reports that Russian casualties were rising as some units were conducting reliable maneuvering defensive operations while others were withdrawing from their own minefields. This was in response to reports that Russian casualties were rising as some units were conducting maneuvering defensive operations while others were withdrawing from their own minefields. The Ministry of Defense did not disclose any additional information in its statement. However, it is believed that Ukrainian forces have made significant headway and have broken through to the first line of Russian resistance. Kyiv is taking great care to maintain radio silence over the military offensive in certain regions. It would appear that Russian President Vladimir Putin would come to the conclusion that he cannot win on the battlefield if Ukraine continues to gain territory. The more ground that Ukraine makes up, the better its position will be when it comes to the negotiations. The offensive has only just begun. We are still in the early stages. We do not know if today will be the moment when the tide of the conflict turns, but we can see that the Ukrainians are gaining ground and taking back more territory. It would appear that the battle will continue in this fashion. We are in a position to declare that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, will soon make good on his vow to rid all of his territories, including the Crimean Peninsula, of the invaders. In order to have access to reliable and up-to-date news from all over the world, don't forget to follow us and like the video.